In the summer of 1942, America was still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor. Across small towns and quiet farmlands, from Kansas wheat fields to Texas ranches, from the docks of Boston to the hills of Tennessee, thousands of young men, barely 18 or 19 years old, stood in lines at recruiting offices, ready to fight a war they scarcely understood. They were farm hands, mechanics, school teachers, and paper boys, drawn by duty, anger, and a vague promise that the Marines were the first to fight. When they signed their names, they didn't know they were volunteering for the battle that would forge the first great land victory of the Pacific War. They would become the 1st Marine Division, and their crucible would be a place few had ever heard of, Guadalcanal. The division was officially activated in early 1941, long before the United States entered the war. It was a patchwork of units from both coasts, pulled together under the command of Major General Alexander Archer Van de Grift, a calm, methodical officer whose quiet confidence masked a will of iron. In July 1942, his division, roughly 19,000 strong, was ordered to a secret staging area in New Zealand. Most of the men had never even left their home state. Now they were halfway around the world, training for something that didn't yet have a name. Their orders came suddenly, and their timeline was brutal. They had 10 days to prepare for America's first offensive against Japan. No one could tell them exactly where they were going. No one could tell them what awaited them there. Their equipment was untested, their maps incomplete. Supplies were short, and intelligence reports contradictory. They were told only that Japanese forces had begun constructing an airfield on a small island in the southern Solomon chain, a runway that, if completed, could threaten Australia and the entire Pacific lifeline. The island's name, Guadalcanal, meant nothing to them then. Within months, it would mean everything. For most of these Marines, war was still an abstraction. Their boot camp instructors had barked slogans about honor, courage, and commitment, but now the ocean stretched endless in gray before them, and reality sunk in. On the decks of transport ships bound for the tropics, they polished rifles, checked rations, and wrote last-minute letters home. "Tell Mom I'll be home by Christmas," many of them said. It was a lie they needed to believe. On August 7, 1942, as dawn broke over the Solomon Sea, the world they knew ended. Operation Watchtower, the first American amphibious assault of World War II, was underway. The 1st Marine Division's objective was simple in theory, but terrifying in practice. Land on Guadalcanal, capture the unfinished airfield, and hold it. What awaited them on shore was a mystery. The Japanese had fortified islands across the Pacific with bunkers, artillery, and garrisons that fought to the death. No one knew if Guadalcanal would be the same or worse. As their landing craft pitched through rough surf toward the beach, the Marines clutched their M1 rifles and stared into the green wall of jungle ahead. The air smelled of salt, diesel, and fear. For many, this was their first time under fire. The naval bombardment thundered behind them, and the world became a roar of smoke and sea spray. When the ramps dropped, they ran, not with heroism, but with instinct. They splashed through waist-deep water and fell onto coarse black sand. For a moment, there was silence. No gunfire, no resistance. The jungle loomed quiet. Some thought it was a trick. Others thought they'd landed in the wrong place. Then came the realization that Japanese had fled the immediate coast, retreating inland after the bombardment. For the first few hours, Guadalcanal seemed almost peaceful. The Marines advanced cautiously, finding the half-finished airstrip. The Japanese engineers had been building it meticulously before vanishing into the trees. They found abandoned tools, rice bowls still half full, letters written in neat kanji scattered across the dirt. It was eerie, like stepping into someone else's interrupted life. By nightfall, the illusion of peace shattered. From the darkness beyond the jungle, the first Japanese shells whistled through the air and exploded among the palm trees. Snipers fired from invisible positions. The Marines hit the ground and returned fire into the blackness, shooting at flashes they couldn't see. The first men fell, and for the first time the 1st Marine Division understood what contact meant. It was no longer training, it was survival. Over the next few days, the Marines dug in around the airfield, fortifying their perimeter with sandbags, logs, and wrecked machinery. They called the runway Henderson Field, after a Marine pilot killed at Midway. They didn't know it yet, but this muddy strip of earth would become the most fought-over piece of ground in the Pacific. Every night, the Japanese attacked in small groups, screaming "Banzai!" and charging through the jungle. Every morning, the Marines counted the bodies and buried their dead under the same sun that burned their skin raw. The farm boys from Kansas and Iowa, who'd never seen an ocean before this war, were now sleeping in foxholes filled with rainwater and corpses. They learned to move silently, to shoot by instinct, to eat when they could, and to sleep with one eye open. The heat was unbearable. Mosquitoes carried malaria. Dysentery swept through the camps. The canned rations spoiled, the water turned green, and every man lost weight. And yet, they fought. They fought not because they were fearless, but because they were together. Each night, as they listened to the droning engines of Japanese bombers overhead, they whispered home to themselves, the smell of cornfields, the laughter of sisters, the taste of coffee at sunrise. They began to realize that Guadalcanal was not just another battle. It was a test of whether America could endure a war that would last years, not weeks. Major General Vandegrift wrote in his field diary, "They are children no longer. Guadalcanal is teaching them faster than any school ever could." He watched as his division changed before his eyes, boys into soldiers, soldiers into warriors. They were exhausted, half-starved, and terrified, but their discipline held. By mid-August, the Japanese had begun to regroup for a counterattack, and the 1st Marine Division, cut off from supplies after the Navy temporarily withdrew, stood alone on the island. But in those desperate nights, something unbreakable formed among them. They started calling themselves the Old Breed, half in jest, half in pride. They had come to Guadalcanal as rookies. They were now veterans of a war that had only just begun. What none of them could know then was that the fight for Guadalcanal would last 6 long months, and that when it was over, the 1st Marine Division would no longer be an experiment. They would be the foundation of every victory that followed. The nights on Guadalcanal were long, hot, and alive with fear. The jungle was a living thing, thick, wet, and filled with eyes. The Marines of the 1st Division had taken Henderson Field, but they were far from secure. The Japanese had vanished into the dense interior, only to return in waves of stealth and fury. No man slept easily. Each sound, each branch snapping, each insect droning might have been the start of another attack. It was here, under the choking canopy of the tropics, that America's first great land battle of the Pacific truly began. In the 2nd week of August 1942, the Marines discovered just how determined their enemy was. The Japanese 17th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, had ordered a counterattack to retake the island. He believed the Americans were a small, disorganized force, no more than a few thousand. The Imperial Japanese Army, whose soldiers had never been defeated on land, would sweep them into the sea. It was a fatal miscalculation. On the night of August 21, 1942, the Japanese struck along the banks of the Ilu River, known to the Marines as the Tanaru. They came in the dark, shouting "Banzai!" and firing their rifles wildly. The Marines waited until the attackers were almost at their wire before opening fire. Machine guns tore through the night, their tracers carving orange lines across the black water. Men screamed, fell, and kept coming. When the sun rose over the jungle, nearly 900 Japanese soldiers lay dead along the riverbank. It was the first time American forces had stopped a full-scale Japanese assault on land, and the first time the myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered. After Tanaru, the Marines stopped being cautious. they became hunters. Patrols fanned out into the jungle, following trails littered with helmets, rifles, and the bodies of the fallen. They discovered that the Japanese soldiers fought with almost religious devotion, refusing to surrender even when wounded or surrounded. It changed the way the Marines fought. There would be no mercy, no negotiation, only endurance. In September, the Japanese struck again, this time at the heart of the Marine position near Lunga Ridge, just south of Henderson Field. Under the cover of a tropical downpour, more than 3,000 Japanese troops attacked a thin line of Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt "Red Mike" Edson. His men were exhausted, soaked, and outnumbered 5-1. The ridge, a narrow spine of coral and mud, became the most important piece of ground on the island. If it fell, so would the airfield. All through the night of September 12-13, the Marines fought off wave after wave of attackers. Bayonets flashed in the lightning, grenades exploded at arm's length, and men fought hand-to-hand in the mud. The Japanese came so close that at times the lines dissolved into chaos, knife against rifle, scream against scream. When dawn broke over the jungle, Edson's raiders held their ground. The ridge was carpeted with bodies. Edson, covered in grime and blood, told his surviving men, "You did it. You stopped them. Now get some rest." The men just stared, too dazed to move. They had lost a third of their number, but they had saved Guadalcanal. The next morning, General Vandegrift walked the battlefield. The smell of death hung thick in the air. He later wrote, "They looked like boys, but they fought like veterans." The victory at Edson's Ridge would go down as one of the defining moments of the Marine Corps, but there was no celebration, only exhaustion. Henderson Field still needed defending, and the Japanese were not finished. In October, reinforcements from Japan began to pour in. The Imperial Navy, using fast destroyers nicknamed the Tokyo Express, landed troops and supplies under cover of night. Each dawn brought more enemy soldiers, more artillery, and more air raids. The Marines, now short on ammunition, food, and medicine, fought to keep the airfield operational. The Cactus Air Horse, a ragtag collection of Marine, Navy, and Army pilots flying from Henderson, became their lifeline. These pilots, flying worn-out F-4F Wildcats, SBD Dauntlesses, and a few battered P-400s, provided the only air cover over the island. Every gallon of fuel, every bullet, every crate of food had to be guarded like treasure. Then came the Battle for Henderson Field, October 24th to 26th, 1942. It was the largest and bloodiest assault of the campaign. The Japanese sent over 7,000 men, supported by artillery, to overwhelm the Marine perimeter. For 2 nights, the jungle was alive with fire and steel. Flares turned the sky white as Japanese infantry charged through mud and rain, only to be met by walls of machine gun fire. Some Japanese units fought until every man was dead. Others crawled into Marine lines pretending to surrender, then detonated grenades. By the morning of the 26th, the field was secure. The Marines had held. Nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead in the grass around the perimeter. The Marines had lost fewer than 100. One survivor, Sergeant John Basilone, had manned 2 machine guns through the night, fighting until his hands blistered and his barrels melted from heat. He would later receive the Medal of Honor, the first Marine enlisted man to do so during the war. But victory came at a terrible price. The 1st Marine Division was worn to the bone. Men's uniforms hung loose on their skeletal frames. Many had malaria, dysentery, or dengue fever. Their boots rotted, their weapons rusted, and still the Japanese kept coming. In the foxholes, men whispered about home, about the smell of rain in Iowa, the sound of trains in Alabama,
the way the sky looked at sunset. Guadalcanal was changing them. They no longer dreamed of medals or glory. They dreamed of surviving another night. When word finally reached them that reinforcements from the U.S. Army were on the way, it felt like salvation. But even as relief approached, the Marines knew something deeper had been forged. They had endured what no American force had faced before: relentless jungle war, hunger, and an enemy who fought to die. By November 1942, the tide began to turn. The Japanese Navy suffered crippling losses at sea, their supply lines strangled by Allied submarines and air power. The Tokyo Express slowed. The Japanese on Guadalcanal, starving and desperate, began to withdraw. And through it all, the 1st Marine Division held the line, proving to the world and to themselves that the United States could fight, bleed, and win. For the boys who had left home as recruits, Guadalcanal had become a crucible. Their youth was gone, their innocence burned away in the firelight of battle. But something stronger remained: pride, brotherhood, and the unbreakable belief that they could stand against anything. General Vandegrift, in a letter to his wife, wrote simply, "They have been baptized in fire. Whatever happens now, they are Marines."
By November 1942, the 1st Marine Division had been on Guadalcanal for nearly 3 months, and the island had become a nightmare of rot, rain, and death. The smell of decay clung to everything: the earth, the tents, even the men themselves. The once proud division that had landed with clean uniforms and full packs was now a ghost army of hollow-eyed fighters, their bodies wasting away from disease and exhaustion. The jungle did not care who won or lost. It devoured both sides equally. Yet somehow, through sheer stubbornness, the Marines kept fighting. The enemy, too, was suffering. The Imperial Japanese Army had underestimated Guadalcanal from the beginning. They had assumed the Americans would be driven off quickly, but by late 1942, it was clear the opposite was happening. The Japanese 17th Army, isolated and starving, had begun to crumble. Their supply ships, the so-called Tokyo Express, were being hunted down by American aircraft and submarines. Every night, the Japanese tried to land food, ammunition, and reinforcements, but the sea had turned against them. For every ship that reached the island, 3 were sunk. Men who made it ashore were already weak, half-starved, and carrying supplies that would last only days. But still, they fought. In December, the Japanese launched another desperate offensive near Mount Austin, a ridge of jungle and stone that dominated the interior. From this high ground, they could fire down on Henderson Field, if they could take it. The 1st Marine Division, already exhausted, was ordered to attack first. The terrain was brutal, steep, overgrown, and filled with caves. The Japanese had turned the hills into fortresses, carving bunkers from coral and hiding snipers in the trees. Every yard of ground was paid for in blood. Private First Class Robert Leckie, a Marine with H Company, later wrote, "The rain came down like knives. You couldn't see 5 feet in front of you, but you could hear them breathing in the jungle. They were always there, in the shadows, waiting." The fighting at Mount Austin lasted weeks. The Marines, weakened by malaria and dysentery, attacked again and again, with bayonets, grenades, and flamethrowers. At times, the battle seemed endless, a grim contest of will between 2 armies refusing to surrender. By early January 1943, the Marines finally broke through. Mount Austin fell, and with it the last Japanese stronghold threatening the airfield. The victory was costly. Entire platoons had been wiped out. Hundreds of men were too sick to fight. The heat, the insects, and the hunger had done what bullets could not. "We had become animals," one Marine recalled. "We fought for food, for water, for sleep. The jungle stripped us of everything except the need to survive." Even as they held the island, the Marines faced a new enemy: their own bodies. malaria infected nearly 65% of the division. The symptoms were vicious: fever, chills, delirium. Men would shake uncontrollably, their teeth chattering as they lay in the mud clutching rifles too heavy to lift. The only medicine came from quinine tablets that tasted like metal and hope. Food was scarce: sea rations, hardtack, and whatever they could scavenge from captured Japanese stores. They boiled rice mixed with insects, chewed on moldy biscuits, and drank rainwater that stank of rot. But still, they fought. Somehow, the bond between the men grew stronger with every hardship. The 1st Marine Division became a family forged in misery. They shared everything: cigarettes, food, even malaria pills. They fought not for medals or headlines, but for each other. If you ran, your buddies died, so you didn't run, one corporal said simply. Meanwhile, far across the Pacific, in Washington and Tokyo, generals and admirals argued over maps and strategy, unaware of what it truly meant to fight on Guadalcanal. For the men on the ground, there were no grand tactics, only the daily struggle to stay alive. Every dawn brought another attack, another patrol, another funeral. The Japanese artillery shelled the airfield every night, and American planes took off every morning to strike back. The rhythm of war had become routine. As the months dragged on, replacements began arriving: soldiers from the U.S. Army's 25th Infantry Division and 147th Regiment. They brought new supplies, ammunition, and a sense of relief. The Marines were finally being rotated out. When the order came for the 1st Marine Division to withdraw in January 1943, many of the men were too weak to walk. They boarded ships in silence, staring back at the island that had nearly destroyed them. When they reached Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides, Navy doctors were shocked by what they saw. The average Marine had lost more than 25 pounds. Many could barely stand. But their eyes, sunken, bloodshot, unblinking, told a different story. They had seen the worst and survived. They were no longer the boys who had landed that August. They were veterans now, the old breed. Back on Guadalcanal, the battle was nearly over. In February 1943, the last Japanese troops evacuated under the cover of darkness. Out of nearly 36,000 soldiers sent to the island, fewer than half escaped alive. The Imperial Army, which had once seemed unstoppable, had suffered its first decisive defeat. The victory cost the Americans dearly, but it changed everything. Guadalcanal proved that Japan could be beaten, not just at sea or in the air, but on the ground. When the Marines of the 1st Division heard the news, they didn't cheer. There were no parades, no speeches. They were too tired to celebrate. Most just stared into the ocean, their thoughts drifting to friends who hadn't made it off the island. "We won," one sergeant said quietly, "but at what price?" That price would echo through every campaign that followed, through Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, and Okinawa. And every time new recruits joined the Corps, the veterans of Guadalcanal would look at them and say, "You don't know what war is. We learned the hard way." It was on that island of mud and misery that the legend of the 1st Marine Division was born. Guadalcanal had taken their youth, but given them something in return: an identity, a brotherhood, and the unshakable conviction that nothing could ever be harder. And when historians later wrote of the Pacific War, they would agree: before Midway, the Pacific was Japan's ocean. After Guadalcanal, it belonged to the United States.
When the 1st Marine Division left Guadalcanal in early 1943, they were no longer the green recruits who had landed half a year earlier. They were gaunt, burned, and hollow-eyed, living ghosts of the tropical inferno they had survived. Doctors said they were unfit for combat. Commanders said they had earned rest. But among the men themselves, something else had taken root: a quiet pride that could not be measured in medals or headlines. They had endured what no American unit ever had, and in doing so, they had become something more than soldiers. They had become the old breed. At Espiritu Santo, the division was rebuilt, bone by bone. New uniforms replaced rags. Rifles were reissued. Quinine flowed like gold to combat the lingering malaria. But the real rebuilding happened inside. The new replacements, fresh-faced kids from Kansas, New York, and California, arrived by the hundreds. They looked at the veterans with awe and a bit of fear. These were the men of Guadalcanal, the ones who had stopped the Japanese tide. When they spoke, it was in low tones, with that peculiar marine calm that comes only after seeing hell. Officers like Vandegrift and Red Mike Edson understood what had been forged in those months. The 1st Marine Division wasn't just a fighting force now, it was the model for the future of the Marine Corps. Guadalcanal had proven that small, aggressive amphibious units could seize and hold territory even in the face of superior numbers. It had rewritten the playbook for Pacific warfare. The lessons learned there, how to coordinate naval gunfire, air support, and infantry advances, became the foundation of the island-hopping campaigns to come. The world, too, was watching. American newspapers hailed Guadalcanal as the first great land victory of the Pacific. President Roosevelt called it a turning point in the war against tyranny. But for the Marines themselves, there was no glamour in the memory. People said we were heroes, one veteran wrote later. But heroes don't stink of malaria and bury their friends in jungle mud. Their victory had come not from grand strategy, but from endurance, courage, and the ability to keep going when everything human told them to stop. By mid-1943, the division was once again in fighting shape, and the Marines were restless. Many of them, barely out of recovery, volunteered for the next major offensive, Cape Gloucester in New Britain. The terrain there was worse than Guadalcanal: black swamp, poisonous insects, and torrential rain that never ended. At least Guadalcanal had beaches, one Marine joked grimly. Yet when the order came, they went without hesitation. The old breed had learned a truth that every warrior eventually discovers. Once you've survived the worst, fear loses its grip. Meanwhile, the legend of the 1st Marine Division was spreading across the Pacific. New recruits arriving at boot camp heard the stories whispered like gospel. The ridge at Edson's Line, the Tenaru River, the desperate nights at Henderson Field. Their patch, the blue diamond with the red numeral 1 and the stars of the Southern Cross, became a badge of honor. It wasn't just a symbol of victory, it was a reminder of what it cost. As the division prepared for its next battles, the Japanese were still struggling to understand what had gone wrong. Imperial staff officers in Tokyo pored over reports from Guadalcanal and concluded that the Americans' iron discipline and material strength had overcome superior Japanese spirit. But what they didn't understand was that the American strength hadn't come from material things. It had come from the spirit of ordinary men, the farm boys, truck drivers, and students who had been transformed by fire. By 1944, the 1st Marine Division had become the backbone of the Allied push through the Pacific. They spearheaded amphibious landings at Cape Gloucester, then Peleliu, and finally Okinawa, the bloodiest battle of the entire Pacific War. Each time they carried with them the same toughness and grim determination that had been born on Guadalcanal. They called themselves the old breed, but in truth, they were the new face of American warfare. An army of citizen soldiers who could match the Empire of Japan blow for blow. One reporter embedded with the division during the Cape Gloucester campaign described them as men who have already been to war and come back unafraid. Their commanders no longer worried about morale or courage. The challenge now was keeping them alive, long enough to pass on what they knew. Young Marines entering the line learned fast. If a man with the Guadalcanal patch told you to keep your head down, you did it without question. The Marine Corps, once a small and often overlooked branch of the U.S. military, now found itself at the center of global attention. The lessons of Guadalcanal reshaped how America fought. Naval aviation became the shield. Amphibious infantry became the sword. The partnership between sailors, pilots, and Marines, honed in the crucible of that island, became the formula for victory from the Solomons to Iwo Jima. When General Vandegrift returned to the United States in late 1943 to receive the Medal of Honor, he didn't speak of glory or conquest. Standing before the press, he said simply, "Guadalcanal was not won by generals. It was won by young men who refused to quit." That humility became the defining spirit of the 1st Marine Division. Even decades later, when historians called Guadalcanal the turning point of the Pacific War, the survivors would only nod and say, "We were just doing our job." But they all knew, deep down, that they had done something extraordinary. They had held the line when America's fate still hung in the balance. By war's end, the 1st Marine Division had earned a reputation that would last forever. They had fought in the worst conditions imaginable, faced an enemy who never surrendered, and still emerged victorious. They had proven that America's strength was not in its machines or its resources, but in the will of its ordinary citizens when pushed to the edge. And though many of them would return home to quiet lives, farming, teaching, raising families, their legacy remained written in blood and courage across the jungles of the South Pacific.
When the guns finally fell silent over the Pacific in August 1945, the men of the 1st Marine Division had been fighting for 3 relentless years. From Guadalcanal to Cape Gloucester, from Peleliu to Okinawa, they had left a trail of victories written in blood and endurance. But it was that first battle, the jungles of Guadalcanal, that remained the heart of their legend. Long after the war, the survivors would say the same thing. Everything we became started there. The victory at Guadalcanal was more than a military triumph. It was a psychological and strategic turning point that reshaped the Pacific War. For the Japanese, it shattered the illusion of invincibility. For the Americans, it proved that their citizen soldiers could not only endure hardship, but defeat the finest troops of the empire. The 1st Marine Division's stand had forced Japan onto the defensive for the first time. From that moment on, the question was no longer if Japan could be beaten, but when. Strategically, Guadalcanal opened the path to the Solomon Islands, and beyond them, the Philippines and Japan itself. Henderson Field became the springboard from which Allied aircraft dominated the surrounding seas, cutting off Japanese supply lines and crippling their ability to reinforce other strongholds. The Imperial Navy, once feared as unstoppable, suffered irreplaceable losses trying to retake the island. The myth of the rising sun's eternal advance ended there, in the mud and rain of an island most Americans had never heard of before the war. For the U.S. Marine Corps, Guadalcanal was a transformation. Before 1942, the Corps had been seen as a small expeditionary force, brave but secondary to the Army and Navy. After Guadalcanal, that perception changed forever. The 1st Marine Division's performance turned the Marines into a symbol of America's fighting spirit. Their blend of discipline, aggression, and brotherhood became the standard for every operation that followed. Generals studied their tactics. Recruits memorized their stories. The term, "the old breed," entered Marine Corps lore as a badge of reverence. It referred not just to those who fought on Guadalcanal, but to every Marine who learned from their example, every man who crawled through mud, carried his buddy out of a foxhole, and refused to quit when the world seemed to be falling apart. But the legacy of Guadalcanal was also deeply human. Many of the survivors carried the island with them for the rest of their lives. The sounds of jungle rain, the smell of death, the memory of friends lost to disease or bullets, these things never faded. Some returned home and tried to forget. Others joined the Corps as instructors, determined to prepare the next generation for what war truly meant. One Marine years later summed it up simply: "You never leave Guadalcanal. Part of you stays there, forever young and scared and proud." In the years following the war, historians and military analysts would dissect the battle's lessons. They noted that Guadalcanal had tested not just America's weapons, but its will. The campaign had been fought on the edge of failure, short on supplies,
leadership, and experience. Yet the Marines had held. That endurance became a blueprint for future conflicts, Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Whenever the United States faced impossible odds, the spirit of Guadalcanal was invoked, a reminder that victory begins with the refusal to surrender. The strategic importance of Guadalcanal also shaped post-war policy. It proved that control of airfields and sea routes was the key to dominance in the Pacific. It validated the doctrine of amphibious warfare, the very doctrine that would define the Cold War and beyond. Every beachhead from Incheon to Fallujah carried echoes of Henderson Field. The veterans themselves formed one of the most close-knit brotherhoods in military history. They reunited every year, wearing their old patches and retelling stories that only they could understand. They laughed about the misery, the mud, the malaria, because only laughter could soften the memory. When one of them passed, the others would raise a glass and say, "Another old breed reported for duty." General Alexander Vandegrift, their commanding officer, once wrote in a letter to the Marine Corps Commandant, "The 1st Marine Division gave us more than victory. It gave us an identity. Guadalcanal was our crucible, the place where the spirit of the Marine Corps was reborn." Even in the decades after the war, that identity endured. Young Marines studying at Paris Island and Camp Pendleton learned about the ridge at Edson's Line, the stand at Henderson Field, and the relentless courage of those who fought there. The Guadalcanal campaign became required reading, not as ancient history, but as a living guide to what the Corps expected of its men: honor, discipline, and the will to endure when all else fails. The physical island itself, once a battlefield, grew silent. Jungle vines reclaimed the foxholes and gun pits. The airfield that men had died to defend was renamed Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton R. Henderson, one of the first Marine pilots killed in the battle. Today, it still serves as the international airport of Honiara, a quiet symbol of how war's scars can become bridges to peace. When the last Guadalcanal veterans were asked what they had fought for, their answers were rarely grand or political. "We fought because we had to," said one, "because the guy next to us needed us, because America needed someone to stand." And that, more than any strategic analysis or historical summary, is the real legacy of the 1st Marine Division. They were young men thrown into an impossible fight on a forgotten island, and they refused to yield. In doing so, they changed the course of a war and defined what it meant to be a Marine. In the end, Guadalcanal was not just the site of a battle, it was a proving ground for a generation. It was where ordinary men became legends, where America learned that courage could turn the tide of history, and where the 1st Marine Division earned its immortal name, the Old Breed.